Nietzsche translated flatly into English, and into French he took on an additional dimension. And his understanding of anarchy was not people running amok in the streets, but puffy people sitting behind desks every day without doing any good. For the French poets, there was either boredom or anguish, a feeling of being caught up and pummeled around dangerously within an inch of life, and then miraculously being spared. And the phew that escaped one's lips was the same feeling as the first bite of a good cold beer, not the warm dagger of a brandy, but that narrow miss of having escaped a certain demise, followed by the fresh feeling of newly recovered freedom. And the phew that would get flat and stale and predictable without the presence of danger. But mostly the French poets were motivated by a fear of going crazy. After hearing all this French blather, the Americans didn't care whether or not Hitler marched into Paris. And Nietzsche had read these French poets and had absorbed their notion of the crest line and the, quote, ecstatic revelation of the impossible, close quote, that blurred the boundaries of reality and freed them from remaining too cautious or too predictable. And half the fun of opposing the Nazis occupying France was the fact that sometimes their poetic endeavors resulted in death. Nietzsche had studied the Greek myth of the Minotaur, where the first human to face a particular struggle and escape successfully would win the prize. And thus he wrote, "Out of life's school of war, what does not destroy me makes me stronger." Assuming, however, that there is such a struggle for existence, and indeed it occurs, its result is unfortunately the opposite of what Darwin's school desires, and of what might perhaps desire with them, namely, and what one might perhaps desire with them, namely, in favor of the strong, the privileged, the fortunate exceptions. The species do not grow in perfection. The weak prevail over the strong again and again, for they are the great majority, and they are also more intelligent. Darwin forgot the spirit. That is English. The weak have more spirit. One must need spirit to acquire spirit. One loses it when one no longer needs it. Whoever has strength dispenses with the spirit. Let it go, they think in Germany today. The Reich must still remain to us. Footnote. Quotation from Luther's most famous hymn, Ein Festeberg. In its original context, Reich refers to the kingdom of God. The Portable Nietzsche, page 522-3, note in original. Nietzsche was not a communist, even as he took aim at the elite, since communism intended to grind everyone down to the same level, while Nietzsche wanted to raise those who qualified to a higher standard, so communists thought he was a snob. To make things worse for the new revolutionaries who were trying to get the flag of communism hoisted, Nietzsche wrote about the history of belief by introducing the question, what is stronger, science or faith? The Catholic Church had grown under the banner of faith, while scientists had been considered practitioners of magic and witchcraft, and the Protestants had been more sympathetic to science and had fostered its growth under their wings, while the Nazis would elevate science into a religion all its own. The first person to have preached Christianity in Austria had been a monk from Ireland named Columbanus, who arrived sometime in the 7th century, right after Mohammed had been born in the Sea of Sands. The Germans had become good Catholics within the Holy Roman Empire, and the Germanics had 5 basic groups: the North, the South, the East, and the Western Germans, and then there were the Schwabians. Hans J.C. Grimmelshausen wrote about the Swabians in Simplicius Simplicissimus, the first ever adventure novel, written 200 years before Nietzsche moved in with the Wagners, on Lake Lucerne in Switzerland. The University of Basel, where Nietzsche taught, was on the Rhine River, within 1 mile of both the German and the French border. And the Wagners, The Wagners were 50 miles away by train south of Nietzsche's teaching job at the university. Lake Lucerne had been called the Swabian Sea when Charlemagne lived there before Switzerland was folded into the Holy Roman Empire under Rudolph I in 1273. Switzerland was half the size of South Carolina, and part of Switzerland had been in Frederick Barbarossa's Swabian kingdom before Zareich became Zurich, when the robber barons in their robber castles, who'd been plaguing people trading on the Rhine River, were soundly defeated by the Holy Roman Emperor. The origin of the donut was in Swabia, from the town of Trudinger, and Rudolph I's friends were Swabians, quote, who were resented in Austria as foreign intruders, according to the Blue Guide to Austria on page 14. The most Germanic of all German poets had been born in Swabia, and Friedrich von Hellingrath was collecting all his writings when the Great War broke out, and von Hellingrath volunteered and was killed in action at Verdun while fighting for the fatherland on the 14th of December in 1916. The French had spent a year at Verdun trying to capture the bridges on the Meuse River, and each side had lost 150,000 men killed, and Verdun was 34 miles west of Metz, that was on the Moselle leading to the Rhine. Losses had been much lighter during the Battle of Verdun because it was trench warfare rather than the costlier battles of movement, and the final engagement in the Battle of Verdun began on the 15th of December, the day after von Hellingrath died, and the French troops moved forward after a 6-day bombardment of 1,170,000 shells fired from 830 guns. The German lines had collapsed, and that allowed the French to move forward 5 miles. But French soldiers had already begun to mutiny that summer, so the Germans were holding out great hope that the war would soon be won. Friedrich Hölderlin had been born 40 miles from the French border, due east of Verdun, and Nietzsche had enjoyed Hölderlin's poetry, and a special field edition of Hölderlin's poems were given to Hitler's troops in 1943. Hölderlin had written about the upper Danube valley that would be Heidegger's home, and Heidegger said that his grandfather had been born in the sheepfold of a dairy farm on the bank of the Danube. Mich erzog der Wohlaut des sauschelnden Hains und lieben lernt ich unter den Blumen im Arme der Garter wuchs ich Gras. I was raised by the gentle murmur of woods, and I learned to love among blossoms, and I grew in the arms of the gods. Johann Christian Friedrich Hölderlin was born in Laufen in 1770, and Laufen meant running stream. And when a doctor gave him 3 years to live, a 34-year-old master carpenter named Ernst Friedrich Zimmer invited Hölderlin to live on the first floor of his house on the Neckar River at the base of the Swabian Alps, where people would visit him for the next 36 years. Hölderlin had gone to Catholic school and then went to a Lutheran seminary in 1788, and he'd translated the first 2 books of Homer's Iliad when he was 16 years old, and then translated Antigone and Oedipus for performances on the German stage. Hölderlin had in effect managed to create a new language situated at the outer limits of intelligibility, neither recognizably Greek nor German, antique or modern, but located in a liminal zone somewhere in between. Friedrich Hölderlin, Hymns and Fragments, translated and introduced by Richard Seaberth, New York, Princeton University Press, 1984, page 25. At the Lutheran Seminary College, one of Hölderlin's classmates was George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was also born in Swabia the same year as Hölderlin, and Hegel's high school graduation essay had been entitled The Abortive State of Art and Scholarship in Turkey. Hegel had lived through the French Revolution as a young man, and he hated it. And his younger brother George Ludwig had died as an officer during Napoleon's march into Russia in 1812. And Hegel said that he wanted to write after the French Revolution in order to bring the written word back to life after it had been used as a murder weapon. Hegel's first book came out in 1807 and was entitled The Phenomenology of the Spirit. And an entire generation embraced Hegel's writing, but it was old stuff to the next generation. People like Ludwig Feuerbach, who wrote bad things about government and said bad things about religion. And he said bad things about the government's religion, and since it was against the law to say anything bad about the government, philosophers mostly wrote about theology instead. After Napoleon had marched through Germany, most universities were forced to shut down because money and resources were scarce, and Hegel struggled to find work, and he finally took a job at a prep school teaching a class called Introduction to Knowledge of the Universal Coherence of the Sciences. Hegel's philosophic thought is very difficult to understand. Hegel himself is reported to have said, "Only one man has understood me, and even he has not." Marx contended that he was the one man who understood Hegel, and claimed that Hegel did not understand himself. Marx took the dialectical portion of Hegelian philosophy, married it to the materialism of Feuerbach, and produced dialectical materialism. You can trust the communists to be communists, page 150. Before his brother was killed, Hürtgen had written poetry about the French Revolution, sympathetic to France, saying that they had, quote, defended human rights, close quote, in contrast to Germany's, quote, abuse of princely power, close quote. But Hürtgen was dismayed when Napoleon became a dictator, and when the poet died in the summer of 1843 at the age of 73. The Jewish Karl Marx was just beginning his career, writing anti-Christian articles for a newspaper in Cologne. Marx was warned by the Prussian government to stop making trouble for the church, especially for the Russian Orthodox Church. So Marx moved from Cologne to Paris in October of 1843 to write incendiary articles for a radical French newspaper. The French government kicked Marx out of France in 1845, and he moved to Brussels, where the government told him that he was welcome only so long as he refrained from political agitation. So instead Marx moved to England, where he would write the Communist Manifesto in 1847, and he published it in February of 1848. The writing already published by Marx in newspapers would cripple the nobility of Europe that year, and would completely crush the Russian government 70 years later in 1917. As the Great War brought down the motherland's beloved sacred Tsar and his lovely family, the flowering upper crust of English nobility was also leveled due to all the officers having been exclusively from that class. And they'd been trained to personally lead the men over the top out of the trenches, resulting in the cream of British royalty perishing in disproportionate numbers. The Great War cut deeply into the percentage of nobles living in the British Isles, and the British Crown was left standing alone after the war to mourn alongside only a handful of sympathetic courtiers. The year of revolutions in 1848 had upended so many normal courses of life, not only in academia but in the entire social order, that Hürtgen's writing had been put into storage for safekeeping, away from the public eye. Nietzsche read Hürtgen when the poet was still unknown, and Nietzsche got an A- on a paper he wrote about Hürtgen's poetry, while the teacher added a note that he should find a, quote, healthier, clearer, more German poet to admire. Hürtgen wrote, "The shoreline spawned in the lake, these gracious swans are drunk from kissing and dip their heads in the sobering holy water." After writing about the gods Apollo and Dionysus in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche dropped Apollo and wrote only about Dionysus, the god of wine and madness. And Nietzsche said that nihilism would beat us when our loathing and our pity joined forces. When Nietzsche had been a medic during the war with France, he'd written a play in between helping wounded soldiers, and the play was about a god who was depressed, but Nietzsche never finished it, and he'd taken the characters in it from Heraldurline. Alone he treads the paths of earth, a pitiful stranger on sacred pastures. Mit dem Tageslicht nur ein Armer auf heiliger Erde wandelt, translated by Elizabeth H., 1962. So how did the Nazis get from Heraldurline's poetry to the drunken horse vessel song? Was it a long or a short leap? German poetry had been written by the wealthy who could afford to do that sort of thing, and among them was Rainer Maria Rilke, who wrote at the beginning of November 1918 a description of a beer hall in Munich, where speakers every night entertained large crowds while thousands stood outside whenever the beer halls weren't large enough to accommodate them, which was usually. After hearing from some professors and practiced speakers, the anarchists were given a chance to speak, and then the students, and then the soldiers who had been at the front for the past 4 years. Rilke said it was all so simple and frank and of the people. And although they sat around the beer tables and between the tables so that the waitresses only ate their way through the human structure like woodworms, it wasn't at all stifling, not even for breathing. The fumes of beer and smoke and people did not affect one uncomfortably. One hardly noticed them. So important was it, and so above all immediately clear, that the things could be said of which the turn had come at last, and that the simplest and most valuable of these things, insofar as they were to some extent made easily accessible, were grasped by the enormous multitude with a heavy, massive approval. Suddenly a pale young worker stood up, spoke quite simply. "Did you, or you, or you, or any of you," he said, "make the armistice offer? And yet we ought to do that, not those gentlemen up there. If we take possession of a radio station and speak, we common people, to the common people yonder, there will be peace at once." I can't repeat it half so well as he expressed it. Suddenly, when he had said that, a difficulty assailed him, and with a moving gesture towards Weber, Kidde, Quitte, and the other professors who stood by him on the platform, he continued, "Here, these professor gentlemen know French. They will help us to say it right, the way we mean it." Wartime Letters of Rainer Maria Rilke, 1914 to 1921, translated by M.D. Herder Norton, New York, W.W. Norton and Company, Inc., 1940, page 101 and 2. Historically, the common people of Germany, most of whom had not been able to read, had embraced Martin Luther's writing that was really raucous in the original German, especially when read aloud in beer halls, and that had helped to spur the popularity of Protestantism. Even more astonishing was the writing of Nietzsche read aloud in German, and his reputation spread until scores of admirers would take the trouble to visit him in his travels, and when they met Nietzsche, people were amazed to find him to be such a well-mannered person. How, if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness, and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything immeasurably small or great in your life must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down over and over, and you with it, a dust grain of dust." The Portable Nietzsche from The Gay Science, page 101. Nietzsche wrote, Think of Luther, the most eloquent and presumptuous of German peasants. Think of his manner of speaking, especially when he held converse with God. Luther's militant attitude toward the mediating saints of the Church, especially that devil's sow, the Pope, was in the last analysis the truculence of a lout toward the Church's etiquette, that reverent etiquette of a hieratic taste, which would admit only the discreet and consecrated into the Holy of Holies, and would exclude the louts. The latter must never be allowed to speak there, but the peasant Luther would have it otherwise. The traditional practice was not German enough for him. He wanted to be able to speak directly in his own voice, informally with his God. Well, that's what he did. Obviously, the ascetic ideal was at no time a school of good taste, much less of good manners. The Genealogy of Morals, translated by Golfing, section XXII, page 282 and 3, ellipse in original. Any translation of Heraldurline was only as accurate as the translator remained true to its Germanic spirit. And much of that understanding came from whether the scholar lived in a city where wine was the drink of choice, or had come from the beer-drinking countryside. To the sun god, where have you vanished? Dazed is my soul and drunk with all your radiant glory, for even now I watched how, tired from your journey, exquisite son of the gods, you lingered to bathe your youthful locks in the golden clouds, and yet I look for him with a spellbound eye, but he has gone away to distant lands to be worshipped by pious peoples. I love you, earth, for mourning with me for him, and like the grief of children our sorrow turns to sleep, and as the playful winds go, rippling and murmuring through the lyra, until the master strikes the authentic tone, so mists and dreams caress us until the God we love returns again to kindle deep in our bosom our life and spirit. German poetry was unique in all the world and stood apart from every other culture, and the Nazis enjoyed singing as they marched to the battlefield, including such poetical Germanic sentiments as, "Ah, the masses enjoy only the marketplace, and the slave can revere none but the masterful. Only those who themselves are godlike can ever believe in gods." Rainer Rilke was writing during Hitler's formative years, and Rainer had always carried a copy of Heraldurline's poetry with him, and he wrote after the Great War, "Austria's walls have fallen in, and now the wind blows over her as over the scene of a conflagration, and all her things lie there exposed, laid bare, and have that improbable disproportioned look that household goods take on when they land in the open." Wartime Letters of Rainer Maria Rilke, 1914 to 1921, page 152. In 1914, one German housewife out of 7 had employed a maidservant, and after the Great War, while Heisenberg was figuring out his quantum theory in 1925, Martin Heidegger was busy working on his masterpiece called Being in Time, or Sein und Zeit, and Heidegger would be targeted as the foremost Nazi of the Nazis, the philosopher that made the whole Hitler movement possible. Heidegger had been born in Swabia in September of 1889, 10 years before the death of Nietzsche. And Heidegger was born in Meeskirch, in Upper Swabia near the source of the Rhine. And Hitler had been born this previous spring. Heidegger's mother had been born west of Krauchenweiss in Swabia, and he was raised a Catholic by his father, Friedrich Heidegger. And in northern Germany were Protestants, and to the south were Catholics, and the Bohemians lived in the middle, but a little easterly towards Russia. The lost crystal had gone missing somewhere in Swabia in the heart of the Black Forest, near the source of the Danube. and the lost crystal had been what gave the German kings power over the Pope. When Heidegger came from Swabia to become a writer and a professor, his most famous line would be, "Happy is he alone who steps armed into these spaces," by which he meant that anyone addressing what Heidegger's critics called his, quote, metaphysical Nazism, must first have done their homework, and that would make them well armed with the requisite information to discuss Heidegger, a lesson that should have been well taken by both Jews fleeing Hitler and Germans ignoring what Heidegger had written in his Being and Time. One of Hitler's wishes was to unite the disparate groups in Germany without regard to their obvious differences, a Swabian to be no different than a Berliner, a Bavarian no more distinct from a Hanoverian than someone from the Tsar who had always been a foreigner. While Jews and Gypsies were quite apart, most Germans resembled one another in their own villages, having intermarried to the point that fear of genetic mutations had become very real by 1930, and the constant incursions in the past from outside their borders had helped, but German people living in farming villages were more alike to each other than they were to their neighbors. One thing Nietzsche had liked about Germany was that they were a mixture of different races. As rector, then as professor of philosophy, Heidegger soon sensed that National Socialism had perverted the drive to resurgence by making so atavistic, cynical, and demagogic a notion as race the center of its ideology. In his 1934-35 lecture course on Hürtgen, he inveighed against such crass biologism, quote-unquote, biologism, attacking one of Rosenberg's ideological prototypes in supremely sardonic style. Herr Kolbenheyer, who is a writer, says that poetry, quote, is a biologically necessary function of the Volk, close quote. We do not need a great deal of intelligence to discern that the same is true of digestion. Digestion, too, is an essential biological function of a people, especially of a healthy people. Martin Heidegger, Nietzsche, Volume 3 and 4, translated by David Farrell Krell, New York. HarperCollins, Inc., 1991, page 269. The footnote read, "The quoted passage now appears in Martin Heidegger's Hölderlin's Hymnen Germanium und der Rhein, Frankfurt am Main, V. Klosterman, 1980, MHG 3927. German universities were run by the state, and when Jews were forbidden to work for the government, people who quit in protest were wasting their time because there were 1,000 people waiting to fill the positions. Heidegger had written a critical paper in 1912 on James' Psychology of Religion, and Heidegger was the first philosopher to discuss the logic of feelings and mood, something new and different than what usually came out of academia. And regular people found it interesting. Heidegger volunteered for the Great War in 1914, but was sent home sick, and then he spent 2.5 years censoring mail in Freiburg, after which he was sent to Verdun and assigned to the weather station. And Germany didn't really lose the Great War, but marched home while diplomats in Paris worked out their future. Heidegger talked about Verzicht in the winter semester of 1919, which meant to abdicate, surrender, or withdraw. And he spoke about the Ablehnung and Aufgeben, the swindle of its aestheticizing intoxication of itself. Heidegger read Einstein and wanted to write a paper for his teaching certificate on, quote, the logical essence of the concept of number, close quote. Heidegger lectured on Parmenides and on Hölderlin and on Nietzsche and on logic, and he finished Being in Time in 1927 as a thesis paper for the credentials necessary to become a professor at the University of Freiburg in the beautiful city where he had served in the army censoring mail. The first geographer to put the name America on a map was the German Martin Waldseemüller, and he'd done it at the University of Freiburg. The largest city in the Black Forest region, Freiburg am Breisgau, is often overlooked by visitors because this scenic and interesting city is off the beaten track. Its strategic location at the southern edge of the Black Forest brought the town in 1368 under the rule of the Austrian Habsburgs, which lasted for more than 400 years. Approached from the Rhine plain on the west, the town is silhouetted against huge mountain peaks towering more than 3,000 feet. Freiburg's situation is responsible for its remarkable climate. In early spring, the town is usually bursting into bloom while the mountain peaks are still covered with snow. In the fall, the smell of new wine fills the narrow streets, while reports of snowfalls on the nearby peaks are already reaching the ears of the townfolk. The reason for this unusual weather is that Freiburg lies in the path of warm air currents that come up from the Mediterranean through the Burgundy Gap, balanced by the winds from the Black Forest hillsides. Frommer's Comprehensive Travel Guide, Germany, 95, by Darwin Porter, assisted by Danforth Prince, New York, Macmillan Travel, Prentice Hall Macmillan Company, Simon & Schuster, Inc., 1969-1995, page 300. Freiburg was in the middle of the Black Forest in Swabia, and the Black Forest was across the Rhine from Strasbourg. And after accepting the job of philosophy professor at the University of Freiburg in 1928, Heidegger would live in Freiburg im Breisgau for the rest of his life. When you visit the Black Forest, or Schwarzwald in German, a region in southwestern Germany, don't expect to come upon a little elf working on a cuckoo clock in his tiny gingerbread shop. What you'll find, however, is nearly as exciting and altogether more enjoyable. The Schwarzwald covers a triangular section of the large state of Baden-Württemberg, roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide. The pine and birch-studded mountains are alive with fairy tale villages, well-equipped spas, and modern ski resorts. Besides the cuckoo clock and the many toys manufactured in the Black Forest, this region is noted for another product, Kirschwasser, an unsweetened cherry brandy derived from the fruit of the black twisted cherry trees. Frommer's Germany, page 288. There were thousands of miles of well-marked hiking trails through the Swabian mountains, and Heidegger had a chalet up in the hills in Tottenauberg, above Freiburg, and he would spend 2 hours every day walking to and from the university. In German, Tottenauberg means death does not live here, and Heidegger's famous Nazi prophecy in Being and Time was summed up in the 76th chapter of the book, right before the chapter given over to a friendly, helpful meditation with his friends Wilhelm Dilthey and Count York on page 449. Dilthey had died when Heidegger was just 21 years old in 1911, after going to the Tyrol, and he was so busy writing that he didn't notice everyone else was either sick or leaving, and Dilthey caught the disease and died, and left plenty of long letters behind. And Martin Buber, who was one of his students, made the funeral arrangements, while William James had seen Dilthey pass out at the dinner table in Switzerland while writing his final letter. The page numbers in the German were different, so from Heidegger's page 395 and the English page 447 to 8, the culmination of Heidegger's warning to the Nazis was as follows. The historiological disclosure of the quote-unquote past is based on fateful repetition, and insofar from quote-unquote subjective, that it alone guarantees the quote-unquote objectivity of historiology. For the objectivity of a science is relegated primarily in terms of whether that science can confront us with the entity which belongs to it as its theme, and can bring it, uncovered in the primordiality of its being, to our understanding. In no science are the quote-unquote universal validity of standards and the claims to, quote, universality, which the quote-unquote they and its common sense demand less possible as criteria of quote-unquote truth than in authentic historiology. Therefore, as factically existing, one has in each case made one's decision for authentic or inauthentic historicality. Nietzsche recognized what was essential as to the, quote, use and abuse of historiology for life, close quote, in the second of his studies, quote-unquote, Out of Season, 1874, and said it unequivocally and penetratingly. He enables us to understand to what extent these possibilities must be united factically and concretely in any historiology which is authentic. Nietzsche's division is not accidental. The beginning of his quote-unquote study allows us to suppose that he understood more than he made known to us. Hannah Arendt was another student of Heidegger's at Freiburg, and she fled Germany in 1933, but before going there, a little reminder from Zarathustra is certainly in order. I fear you near, I love you far, your flight lures me, your seeking cures me, I suffer, but what would I not gladly suffer for you? Who would not love you, you innocent, impatient, wind-swift, child-eyed sinner? And whatever may yet come to me as destiny and experience will include some wandering and mountain climbing. In the end, one experiences only oneself. Portable Nietzsche, Zarathustra, third part, The Other Dancing Song, page 337. An entire mythology grew out of an unsubstantiated claim that Heidegger had an affair with Hannah Arendt, but smearing his name was an easy task after the phenomenologist had died, and false accusation has always been the devil's best trick. Karl Lerwith was another one of Heidegger's students who was a Christian of Jewish descent. And Lerwith said that Heidegger told him that the country would be lost if intelligent people didn't get involved instead of running away, and that all the other smart people had been too refined to work things out with Hitler, and that Heidegger had been left all alone. After the Great War, and before he created the idea of being in the world, Heidegger talked in 1919 about die wahre Wirklichkeit und wirkliche Wahrheit, the true actuality and the actual truth. And he used the word Aufgeschlossenheit, which meant a surrendering oneself, a going under, as in Zarathustra's Deus absconditus, or God in his anonymity. Heidegger said that philosophy began when Isaac Newton studied the apple and wrote his Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. And Heidegger liked the 17th century scientists because they were more like philosophers, as these early scientists had to use thinking instead of proven facts. Heidegger thought that science was more true than mere philosophizing because it used mathematic formulas and numbers to think about things, and so science was phenomenological, while before Newton, people could only turn to the church if they wanted knowledge. After Newton, there was a mathematical way of seeing things, and science was the path towards finding out about the truth. And Heidegger wrote in section C of Modern Science, Metaphysics, and Mathematics, all great insights and discoveries are not only usually thought by several people at the same time, they must also be rethought in that unique effort to truly say the same thing about the same thing. So this became Husserl's clarion call to the things themselves that Heidegger would develop into his phenomenology, and both philosophers said they needed to return to the beginning of thinking, and that meant going back to the Greeks. And there was much about that to thrill the Nazis, who really got going when they found out that Heidegger was teaching a class on Heraldurline. The fervor that gripped Germany was embodied in the following excerpt, though it fails to show the totality of the enthusiasm they enjoyed, because this poem lacks both the music and the physical marching that accompanied their program. The voices of God are as fire, yet with events this great, it is hard to keep the main thing straight. This is no pasture, one must stick to the beginning. But now, things are starting over as before. John, Christ, let me sing of the latter refreshment after the wide desert of waves, but this doesn't work. A fate rings differently, more wonderful, richer to sing. The myth is unfathomable ever since him, and now let me sing the journey of the nights to Jerusalem, and Heinrich wandering, let my courage not abandon me, but first we must grasp this. Names are as the morning breeze, ever since Christ become dreams, fall like error upon the heart and can kill you if you do not weigh what they are and understand. But the attentive man saw the face of the God as they sat together at the banquet hour in the mystery of the vine, and having well decided in his great soul, the Lord pronounced his own death and ultimate love. This he recognized, all is good, whereupon he died. But his friends saw the figure of the renouncer to the very end, and the shadow of the one they loved walked by their side, a plague. For this reason the storms of the Lord thundered in the distance, creating men. Friedrich Hölderlin, Patmos, translated by Seaberth, page 103-5. In going back to the beginnings, Heidegger taught his students that philosophy had begun with the Greeks, and his insistence that one must, quote, look forward by looking back was phrased as Vorwärtsschaut, rückwärtsblickend, not to be a resurrecting of the past or an adopting of primitive thinking, and it also did not include the whole libraries of, quote, philosophical books where, as Rainier said, the top rows already filled come down on one's head and shoulders, among them really great big volumes, encyclopedias, and always one more. In his looking back, Heidegger did not include the Olympic Games or any of the Greek gods admired by the Nazis, who were mostly uneducated. But Nazis were electrified when they heard that Heidegger was teaching about the Greeks, since they thought he meant Spartans, and when they found out he meant Athens, they didn't like Heidegger so much anymore. Homer had created poetry long before Athens and Sparta, who had fought each other to a standstill before the Romans marched in. And the golden age of Greece had ended long before with the death of Aristotle. The Greeks were always known as truth seekers, and Socrates had gifted the world with his Socratic method, while Nietzsche had started the new theory that the ancient Greeks were willful and struggling and earthy. In the Socratic method, all sides of a matter were presented, and then the students were allowed to come to their own conclusions. But instead of learning about this philosophical thinking invented by the Greeks, the Nazis were interested in the fact that the Greeks liked to build machines and mechanical gadgets, such as a steam condenser that would fill a bucket with water to open their temple doors, and they had also made a machine to press grapes. The Greeks had thought the individual was important, and they built cities and started democratic government, and they developed a written language when everyone else on the planet was writing in pictographs and hieroglyphics. The first known use of the word swastika to describe the symbol used by much of the ancient world was in 1871 by Heinrich Schliemann, who was digging for the lost city of Troy from the Trojan War, and Schliemann had discovered over 1,800 ancient samples of the swastika symbol and its variants. The students at the universities studied the Greek language and Greek history as a stable ingredient in their education, not only in Germany but also in England and America. And the Western tradition was a blend of Greek and Jewish thinking, while the scholars of the world of classic Greek antiquity thought Heidegger's writing about the Greeks was quote-unquote primitive. Heidegger thought that, to the Greeks, truth was an unfolding, a revealing of what has not yet been seen, and Heidegger's theory of quote-unquote authenticity was opposed to Marcuse's idea of alienation, and that phenomenon was proven by the example of Martin Luther, having never been exposed to anything Jewish except in his reading of the Old Testament. So when Luther talked about the Jews, he meant those in religious history, not anyone living in the Jewish sectors of German towns. Just as Luther's writing about Jews was meant to be about Jews of the past, not the modern ones, Heidegger would try to tell the Nazis not to treat people like machines, but they simply wouldn't listen. The Olympic Games had begun when the Greeks decided that dead people did not need the gifts piled upon their graves that were intended for use in the afterlife, and so they would compete to find the person most worthy to be given the dead person's belongings. And so the Olympics had been first called the Funeral Games. When Christianity became the religion of state under Constantine, the Olympic Games were suspended and then brought back in 1896, while the carrying of the torch at the start of the Olympics began with Hitler in 1936. Leni Riefenstahl had been in Greenland making a movie called SOS Iceberg when Hitler called her to come make movies for the Nazis, and she would turn Hitler into a star of the silver screen. To film the 1936 Olympic Games, Leni used 172 people running 42 cameras, and it would take her 5 months to edit all the footage. Leni was the first filmmaker ever to use close-ups, and one of Leni's short films called Day of Freedom was about the German army, but it was too frightening for public viewing. Her propaganda movies were the earliest videos available apart from the typical comedy or Western adventure films, and Hitler appeared bigger than life on the screen, which was quite inspiring to the viewing audience. Leni's Olympics movie opened with a runner going up the Danube carrying a torch, running through Bulgaria and Sofia and Yugoslavia and Budapest and Czechoslovakia and then into Germany itself, and naked women were shown dancing as the fire of the torch blended with the sun. Then the athletes with their countrymen paraded proudly past Hitler as he saluted them, and Leni made them appear as a world parade in his honor. The athletes marched like soldiers, while the audience saluted the Nazi flag, and a flock of doves was released, and the first event began with discus throwing. The great carpenter of America started off the event. And then came Schroeder, the German world record holder. Then a Norwegian took his turn throwing the discus. Then Greece. Then another American, followed by a Swede. Then China, France, Germany, Italy. Then Schroeder's last chance. And he was shown in slow motion. And then the American carpenter again. The American wins. Next a girl threw the discus, and the German girl won. Then Germany won both the gold and the silver in the javelin throw, while the officials on the field wore white suits and white ties with white shoes. An Italian girl won the hurdles, and everyone enthusiastically cheered, and she was given a potted plant and a crown, and she gave the Nazi salute. Then Germany again won a gold and a silver medal. Jesse Owens started off running slowly, but left everyone behind in his dust. And then a German won another running event. Then Jesse Owens won again, but the announcer said there had been a following wind, so it wasn't really a record, and a wind gauge was shown whirling around. Now a German girl's last chance to jump over the 6-foot meter bar succeeded, and she hugged her coach, hopped over to a blanket lying in the middle of the stadium, climbed under the blanket, and peeked out before laying her head down for a nap, with a big smile on her face and a swastika sewn onto her chest. Then a Hungarian girl with a gold tooth won. Then Germany won the shot put, and Hitler was shown enjoying the show up so close that it felt we were sitting right in the stands with him. A prolonged close-up of Hitler's face during a German champion's ordeal allowed the viewer to share his anxiety so that the athlete's victory blended with our own triumph, while the camera focused on the Nazi flag flying as the audience jumped to their feet in thunderous applause. Leni's brother would be killed on the Russian front on the 20th of July in 1944, while she was at her father's funeral, and Hitler would die exactly 9 months later, and Leni would weep all night long for him. After the war, Leni was put in jail, and she would be arrested many more times in attempts to get her to understand her transgression, but she never did, and Leni Riefenstahl would die an unrepentant Nazi. In 1952, Leni was acquitted of being a war criminal, but was officially labeled a Nazi sympathizer. So she went to Africa to take pictures of half-naked Africans, and in her search for untouched tribes, Leni found the Nuba, and she learned their language, and they taught her to dance. After the success of the Olympic Games in 1936, the Nazis began prosecuting the Nuremberg laws that had passed in the fall of 1935. And Heidegger said that his writing and his lectures in 1935 had kept his students free from having to become Nazis. 1/3 of the faculty at Freiburg would disappear because of the Nuremberg laws, and Heidegger was disappointed that people were running away from Germany, and he felt abandoned by them. And while it should be noted that freedom includes the ability to travel, having to run away is not traveling. Heidegger was elected the rector of Freiburg University, and as rector, Heidegger refused permission for the Reichsstudentenführing to put up Nazi posters and anti-Jewish banners, and Heidegger didn't allow books to be burned in his libraries, and he hired only deans who were not Nazis, and he kept 2 Jewish professors on the faculty even after being warned to fire them. The rector of the university was elected by a vote of all the professors, and an anatomy teacher received the most votes, while 17 professors voted for Heidegger. When the anatomy teacher left for Switzerland, Heidegger was given the job of rector in April of 1933, and he joined the party on the 1st of May, a requirement for holding that position. Because the university was a state school, Hitler was his new boss, and Heidegger paid dues to the party for the duration. And the month following his appointment, Heidegger gave his rectoral address, 4 months after Hitler became Germany's new chancellor. Heidegger would resign as rector the following February, not because he refused to go along with the Nazis, but because they wouldn't go along with him. Heidegger's resignation became official on the day after Hitler's birthday in April of 1934, when his 1-year term was complete, and the Nazis made Heidegger write a written letter before allowing him to resign, and the letter was written on the 23rd and accepted on the 27th of April in 1934, but that paper did not survive the end of the war. In the early 30s before becoming rector, Heidegger and Husserl and Max Scheler held a public debate at the University of Berlin, and there had been 1,600 people in the audience, and the newspaper duly reported that it had enjoyed, quote, a sports palace atmosphere, close quote. Husserl had been the chairman of the philosophy department at the University of Freiburg for 12 years when Hitler was chosen to become chancellor. And because of the Nuremberg laws, they would keep Husserl on salary, but he was not allowed to teach. Several professors would go to his house to keep him informed about what was going on at the university, and students would be sent with papers and books to his house, but Husserl was forbidden to lecture in public, and it was said that he was quite comfortable with the situation and that they were all just waiting for the Nazi storm to blow over. Husserl's son Wolfgang had died in 1915 near Verdun, and his other son was wounded the next year but survived. And during the Great War, his daughter had served as a nurse. Heidegger was sent to Rome in 1936 to give a lecture about poetry, and he wore a swastika on his lapel and gave a speech about the way National Socialism should be, rather than what was going on in Germany. Heidegger accused the Nazis of Jewifying National Socialism by turning it into a mere tribal conflict. So the Nazis denied Heidegger permission to go to a convention in Paris the following year, in 1937, but the French protested until the Nazis relented at the last minute. Although Heidegger refused to go because in France his On the Essence of Truth and What is Metaphysics were being sold under the table in dust jackets without titles. After 1938, the Nazis made it illegal to mention Heidegger's name in print, and no new copies of his writings were being produced, even though they still had enough paper at the time. Husserl died on the 27th of April in 1938 at the age of 79, and Max Scheler, whose mother was Jewish, said that Heidegger didn't go to Husserl's funeral because he was sick, but that didn't explain why the other professors didn't go either. Heidegger sent flowers to Husserl's widow, while his wife wrote her a long letter, and Heidegger agreed in 1941 to remove his dedication to Husserl from the front page of the fifth printing of Being in Time, but he kept the part about him on page 38 from the German pagination, or page 62 in the English. Heidegger had remained as friendly as ever with the Jewish professors who had been fired, and so the Nazis were angry with him for not hating Jews. And the Archbishop of Germany was mad at Heidegger because the Pope was sympathetic towards Hitler, having lived in Berlin for 4 years as papal nuncio before they made him Pope. If Hitler had read Heidegger, Germany would have taken a different road altogether, and right before Hitler's war, Heidegger wrote in a letter, "I believe that a lunatic asylum viewed from within would offer a more reasonable and clear perspective than this epoch." The Heidegger Controversy, a critical reader, edited by Joel Golb and Richard Wolin, New York Columbia University Press, 1991, from The Political Implications of Heidegger's Existentialism by Karl Lerwith, page 171. Heidegger's lectures were being written down by students and circulated from there, but Hitler was more interested in Heidegger's reputation because Hitler was a politician, not a scholar. The bulk of Hitler's education had come from reading fanciful popular novels and from gossip heard at the homeless hotels, and one of Hitler's favorite authors was Karl May, who had been blind for the first 6 years of his life. And Albert Einstein was also a fan of Karl May, and had said, "My whole adolescence stood under his sign. Indeed, even today he has been dear to me in many a desperate hour." The students were not common folks going to school to learn a trade, but were the children of the cream of society, and few needed scholarships, and most were not expected to have to make a living after they graduated, since higher education was just part of becoming acculturated in that class of people. The students came to the university to find out what they wanted to learn, and they changed majors easily and frequently, and students had no time limits or structured examinations. So while they could sign up for classes, there was no penalty for not attending a class, so the largest classes were those that had the best and most interesting professors. The student dueling clubs were like fraternities, and Heidegger didn't mind them dueling, and he even went to watch them sometimes. But he thought the clubs didn't fit into the modern world and that they worked against the purpose of the university by keeping a class system going. And Heidegger thought that in the wake of the Great War, dueling and its traditions didn't help the students to face an emerging modern society. Max Mueller was a history major who wanted to take Heidegger's class, and as he was looking for the lecture hall, a small man asked him if he could be helpful, and the history student said that he was looking for Heidegger's class, and the small man said, "I am looking for it too. I am Heidegger." The student was invited to the advanced seminar, and Max Mueller said that Heidegger was a different kind of professor, that he would take the students on hiking journeys and would escort them on ski trips. Heidegger hadn't grown up skiing like the rich kids, but was a peasant and had learned to ski when he was older, and he often wore a German peasant costume with knee breeches and a vest. Heidegger would genuflect and bless himself when he took his students to visit churches, and they were amazed because they knew that he was no longer a Catholic, but Heidegger said that he did it out of respect. Because philosophy relied on writing, and writing was about using words, and the meaning of words had been Nietzsche's specialty in philology, Heidegger taught a class on Nietzsche, and the Nazis would show up to his class in uniform and stand in the back at attention. The students would copy down his lectures and compare them with each other to get it right, and the Phenomenology was about real life rather than just scholars having imaginary ideas. And Pergler said that Heidegger didn't mean so much an overcoming of the old metaphysics as a recovery from it. The Heidegger Controversy, from Heidegger's Political Self-Understanding, by Otto Pergler, page 222 and 3. Heidegger stopped teaching Nietzsche in 1940, even though the curriculum listed the course as being taught for the winter semester of 1941-42, but was taught by a different professor who was more politically correct, a criminal lawyer named Kern. Heidegger simply hadn't been saying what the Nazis wanted him to say, and their attempts to put words into his mouth had fallen flat among both the students and the academics, or what was left of them. While the Nazis had a flag, they had no philosophy that they could hang their hat on, and the pressure put on Heidegger to deliver a Nazi philosophy wasn't producing any results. Heidegger told the Nazis that picking and choosing what they wanted out of Nietzsche's writing would be a, quote, mere trick. And Heidegger continued his writing and his lectures even while the Nazis started to call his philosophy silly and shallow. Especially, it was not appreciated that Heidegger had only mentioned Nietzsche twice in Being and Time, on page 264 and 396. And while the Nazis were intent on building a new world, Heidegger was dedicated to rediscovering the old world. Heidegger's philosophy was not about a recreation of reality as the Nazis wanted, but a finding out of what was already extant and what still remained undiscovered, since truth to Heidegger was a revelation of that which had been lost in hiddenness, and that searching to discover entailed an, quote, ecstatic openness, close quote. Martin Heidegger and National Socialism, Questions and Answers, page 85. To Heidegger, truth was an emergence out of darkness that could be made possible within a clearing space where the light of the sun drove away the shadows, and the essence of truth was freedom and was always uniquely personal as, quote, one possesses truth in a genuine sense when one has made it one's own, close quote. The Young Heidegger, Rumor of the Hidden King, by John Van Buren, Bloomington and Indianapolis, Indiana University Press, 1994, page 126. The idea of authenticity, did not apply to a Volk or to a race of people, but only to what could be authentically individual, whether that was an individual country or a group or a philosophy. But what made something authentic was that it satisfied the definition of being truly belonging to itself, not erroneously equated to something with which it was not common or same, nor had been substituted or exchanged with something that altered its essence or either diminished or exalted its standing or its thrownness.